Welcome. This is our 153rd edition of Europe Calling webinar. And today, in cooperation with MEP Michael Bloss, my name is Maximilian Fries. I'm the Managing Director of Europe Calling, and I would like to welcome our guests. I'm going to introduce them later when they give their talks. So today, our topic is the Green Deal of the European Union and what happened over the last 4 years. And Michael Bloss will talk about why we're here tonight, so I'm not going to talk about that, but just some housekeeping remarks. So you can ask your questions as always, and because there's so many of us, we're using Slido for that. The link I've just posted in the chat, so just post your questions on Slido and also evaluate, just score, give other people's questions your score. That's very important. And again, you can select your language. German and English questions will be kept separate so that we know where to look for what. And as always, this webinar is being recorded and will then later on be published on YouTube. So don't keep that in mind when you ask your questions. And now we'll have Michael Bloss to introduce the topic. Michael, please. Well, thank you and welcome everyone. 4,500 registrations. So that means people are really interested in the topic, in tonight's topic. And well, it's a little bit about what did we actually achieve fighting for the climate since 2019, the climate year, when the movement Fridays for Future started, and many people suddenly realized this, it's time to really do something. So a lot has happened at the European level. So we're going to talk about what we've achieved, what still has to happen, but also a really important question is how to deal with resistance. Yes, some things have been achieved, and now we have this situation where climate and environment policy is being marginalized by some actors. So what to do about such resistance and how to find a new sort of dynamism. And so it's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to the debate tonight. Thank you, Michael. So we have almost 2,100 participants in this room now. So let's start directly with our first talk. Professor Dr. Claudia Kemfert, Head of Energy, Transport and Environment of that department at the DIW, the German Institute for Economics. And Claudia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for inviting me to speak. And I have prepared a number of slides, which I would like to project right now, just by ways of introduction, because I thought I should assemble a few thoughts in the present day debate. I think it's quite useful to recapitulate. The Green Deal, is it enough for 1.5 degrees centigrade? Of course not, because we live in times of multiple crises, one shockwave after another, and it all started with the biodiversity loss. Then we have the climate change, which in an unstoppable way is moving forward. The pandemic has contributed to the actual situation of unsettlement and difficulties that people experience. So we think that the Green Deal in general terms is a good idea, certainly, but it's not really good enough. The Green Deal is good. It does open up an avenue to climate protection, environmental protection, but we will certainly not reach the objective of climate neutrality. So it's too late and too little is being done and has been done in the past. And from the scientific research, we know that we should have started much earlier to reduce the global gas house emissions in order to arrive at zero in around 2030. Now we're being offered Trojans, choices that are not really sustainable in the long run, and we can see the consequences of not having been active enough or not having been eager enough to achieve something, and therefore the problems are on the rise. We do have heat waves, we have forest fires, we have extreme weather situations in many parts of the world, and the situation deteriorates in general terms. The other thing that I wanted to mention today is that we need to identify the objectives to such an extent that we will live in a peaceful, in a secure, and in an emission-free world. And this can only be achieved if we use 100% of renewable energy and do not allow those Trojans like the huge blue hydrogen terminals, the LNG terminals, and we're being told that this is emission-free. However, it really isn't. Through the back doors, some emissions escape. And we have done some model calculations in Europe over the past 10 years, and we will repeat explaining to the general public that we can certainly achieve the net zero, but we would have to accelerate the rollout of renewable energy. We need to be able to use eco power and electricity in all sectors, in transport, for example, use the heat pump, for example, in buildings, which is the subject of a heated political debate. And also we need to go for energy savings, because we're deep down in an energy crisis and not seeing the end of it yet. So we also need to move away from dangerous energy sources like nuclear power, for example, and move away from those obsolete power sources. We don't need any new infrastructure projects for them, and about 15 to 20% of stored energy can be covered with renewable energy already. We will become much more efficient. We won't need to import so much energy as in the past. The system of renewable energies can be implemented in all sectors. It is certainly economical and also technically efficient, and that's why we should make most of it and use it. And the last three thoughts that I would like to feed into this debate is that we still live through a time of heightened insecurity. We need peace initiatives, and to move away from conflictual energy sources would be a very smart move in order to improve peace conditions again throughout the world. We need peaceful technologies, and we also need to move away from oil, gas, and coal, obviously, So energy savings are still the best way forward. We need a huge wave of electrification and obviously also to reduce the consumption of power. We need to take all those steps necessary to come to net zero, but they're being blocked. We need a heat transformation in an accelerated way and not a diversion from it. All these new technologies will also create opportunities for new jobs, for new business. So we will really have to transform and should not allow to be left behind by the United States, for example. And I'd like to come to the closure of my opening remarks. We need a decarbonization, expansion of renewables, heating transition, transport transition, the digitization with smart grids and smart mobility. The decentralization is important with stronger local actors and democratization using more intensively the methods of participation, going for acceptance and giving power to the people. It is very important to use these opportunities, and I'd like it to tell you that those who stop in right now will be overrun by the future. Thank you very much. I think it is always a relief to find that we will be able to make it still. And I think that in 2019, we noticed that the climate movement was really instrumental for that. That's why I'm so happy to welcome Luisa Neubauer here, who's one of the co-founders of Fridays for Future. She's the face for the movement, and we look forward to your statement.
Yes, thank you for everything. Thank you for inviting me. And I also am really grateful for this very well-founded scientific input by Claudia, just so people know where we're at. And I think that it's more important than ever to get back to the basics and explain these basic scientific insights that we have and these scientific processes that we know about, we've known about for so long, but people are starting to put that in doubt. So yeah, since 2019, we've seen what happens, what can happen when you build a movement together and when people fight together for just a way to move things. And we've seen the alliances that can happen, but they are particularly useful for sort of abstract goals. But the moment things are becoming more specific and really something has to be changed as the status quo, there is a lot of resistance. And I think we just have to acknowledge that now, and we have to work on that now. And I'd say that at the moment, what we're seeing are three parallel strands of resistance against the climate turnaround, let's call it that. So first, greenwashing. So companies, politicians at all levels, talking about green things, but buying more fossils. I mean, companies, they have climate plans, lots of climate goals and everything, but no actionable ways to get there. There's pressure to adopt plans, but there's no actual way or plans to achieve it. And then also the government, all the pledges on at conference, climate justice, all of the great words that we're hearing. But then when they also work on expanding the liquid gas, etc., and then marketing. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, head of an important cruise ship company told us how sustainable cruises are these days. So there has been a lot of pressure and that's led to changes. But at the moment, it's more the words and terms that are changing, the way people are speaking. And it's really important, of course, that we all know how to talk about climate. It sounds very smooth and it sounds great, but in the background, there's this whole fossil machinery that just continues to work. So greenwashing, green green fables and policies, it's not just a harmless talk. It is actually quite dangerous because it implies that everything is going well, that we're doing what we have to do. And so it's quite important to stop that greenwashing machinery. That's the first resistance strand. And the second one, now when we look at the implementation of such project, federal level or EU level, we are seeing that groups of people are being set against each other and being played against each other. So we can't invest in new carbon neutral structures because it would increase debt for young people. And then when young people say, but we actually want such investments, but then they'll be told, no, that'll be too hard on agriculture or on SMEs or whatever. And so you always put the blame on somebody else. You're just saying, I just want to protect this group, and everyone gets the impression that we're benefiting from leaving things as they are, sticking with the status quo. And of course, that's also very dangerous because the ones that suffer the most are those that are socially the weakest. So the most popular anti-climate talk is that the Green Deal and other projects and measures cannot be implemented because it'll be too harsh socially, too much of a burden. But we know that actually these groups of people will be the ones to suffer the most because let's say, they don't go to the forest in there, and they can't afford to go away and travel to places with clean air or stay in their large houses. They'll breathe the polluted air. And then the third strand of resistance that we see in Germany, but also in other EU member states, that we really see almost like a clash of culture. So the heat pump is no longer a great technological development. That means progress, but it just is something that is between us and our roots that are, with actual wood and fires. And so it's all based on feelings, and they are then sold as values and beliefs. And these types of resistance, the three that I just mentioned, that is really the resistance from the fossil industry. And just to come to an end, there are ways to fight all of this against greenwashing and green myths. Just uncover it. Just keep repeating the basics and explaining what's really happening. And then when groups are set against each other, it's important to have broad alliances, really across generations, across movements, across the democratic political range. So whenever a new populist myth comes up, you can debunk it. And of course, we also have to stick with the true solutions and explain them and how they really improve people's lives today and tomorrow. That is our new task. So it's not about the better point, having the better point or the more important fact, but it's about finding a better alternative and making people's future better in a tangible way. So we need the best narratives, the better platforms. We have to be louder. And of course, we have to realize it's now or never. The fossil lobbies won't stop. they will continue. It doesn't matter how hard the crisis gets. So we have to start and work together and build power where sustainable change is happening. Thank you. You talked about alliances and broad alliances, and that leads us to our next speaker, Jude Kirton-Darling, Vice Secretary General of the EU Industrial Trade Union and industriALL, and she's also a former MEP for Labour before Brexit. So we're happy to have you here in this panel. And maybe you followed it a few months ago. There was a strike. The railway industries and Fridays for Future also went to the streets together with the trade unions. And I think that's the bridge to Jude. So what's your take on all of this? How do trade unions, especially industrial trade unions, see the Green Deal and what should happen next? You have the floor, Jude.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much for the invitation, and especially an English speaker with very bad German that you've included me on your panel. So I bring a perspective from the European level, but from European organised labour. And I think the important point to start off with is there is a lot of common ground. In fact, as the trade union movement, there is a common position across the European trade union movement in support of where we have to get to. We recognise the science and we recognise the challenge of where we're going to by 2050. We were part of the negotiations at Paris. We fought for elements in the Paris climate agreement around the impact on working people and our communities of this transition. And so for us, the crucial thing isn't where we're going, it's how we get there. And it's about how the policy framework is created to ensure that this transition is as socially managed as possible. For us in trade union language, we're talking about a just transition and a fair transformation. And that means that in some ways, we were slightly disappointed by the European Union when the Green Deal was presented. The Green Deal came with all of the rhetorical flourishes of language about not leaving people behind, not leaving workers or their communities or any regions behind. But when you look in the actual legislation, the social dimension of European climate and energy policy and the European Green Deal is actually extremely thin, with the exception of some specific funds which have been bolstered in the context of COVID through the European Recovery Plan. You have the European Social Climate Fund, but it's the counterweight to the extension of the ETS to buildings and transport, which will have a significant impact on those that Luisa was talking about, the weakest in society, those who don't have a choice about how they heat or how they move around. And so there are some very regressive social elements inside the Green Deal, which we as a trade union movement have been fighting. And actually we found allies in the European Parliament in the course of the debate in the European Parliament on the legislation to try and strengthen the social dimension of the Green Deal. But still, the fundamental issue for us is that there is a lack of recognition of the scale of the social transformation that we're embarking on. And this isn't something on the horizon. This is something that our members are already experiencing in many companies and many workplaces across Europe. And that scale of the social implications for us, we can measure it. We reckon that there are about 25 million industrial jobs in Europe, which will have to transform. The vast majority will transform. The sectors will transform as a result of climate action. The jobs will transform. There will be a need for different kinds of skills. There will be a need for different kinds of job profiles. There are sectors which will disappear. as a result. We've already heard the coal phase out will mean the loss of the coal industry in Europe, with implications for workers who are related to the coal sector. But there are other areas of the economy which will be negatively affected. And there are lots of jobs which will be created potentially if we get the policy mix right. And if we combine not just a climate agenda, but also, or an emissions reduction agenda, I should say, but an agenda around circular economy, because the circular economy is really the job-rich part of the green transition. And this is the part which has had the least attention in some ways in the European Green Deal so far, but it's actually the part where we can create lots of jobs in Europe. And what we want to see is an agenda which is about ensuring that those jobs are good quality jobs, because at the moment there is a lot of insecurity. Claudia, you had the slide of the waves of crises that we faced, the recession, the pandemic, the energy price crisis. That has created a lot of economic insecurity for people across Europe. And a lot of insecurity in a period where people know that their industries and their jobs will change. But there's no framework for this change. We have a lot of climate legislation, which sets a very clear framework for companies, for in terms of emissions regulation, in terms of standards regulation. But we have nearly nothing when it comes to actually managing this social transformation. So for us as trade unions, the first and core demand that we still have since 2019 is that we need a comprehensive framework for the just transition in Europe. And for us, that means basically some key pillars of that framework. We need an active industrial policy at European level, which is tied to the Green Deal objectives, so that we can transform and we can create jobs. And that means we need an investment agenda. We know that investment is critically important in also bringing people with us and telling the story of how this is actually a transformation of our economies. We know also, at the moment, at European level, there is a discussion about fiscal rules. There are those who are militating and advocating for austerity 2.0. That will kill the objectives of the Green Deal. What we need is a common investment agenda where investments linked to the Green Deal, linked to the energy transition, the transformation of industries, are considered investments in the future and not costs on the public purse. But we don't want blank checks for business and multinationals. We want those multinationals to have all of that public funding, however it is transferred to business, to come with social strings attached. Social strings which guarantee that there are quality jobs created. And that means a promotion and a strengthening of collective bargaining, because the best way to ensure the quality of jobs is that workers can organize themselves and that they can collectively negotiate their terms and conditions. We need worker participation. Up till now, workers are treated as recipients of decisions, whether that decision is made by management, central corporate management of multinationals or local companies, or whether that decision is made by politicians. Workers are always the recipients of the decision. What we need to reverse is that we have proactive rights to participation. We actually want workers are aware of the direction of travel, and they have ideas about how to ensure that that's a fair transition. And so they should have rights, which mean that they don't have to, the trade unions, the shop stewards don't have to clear up the mess at the end when there's restructuring, but they're right in at the beginning of the process to ensure that that restructuring happens right. And then we have to recognize in Europe that the scale of reskilling and upskilling demands an industrial revolution size social package around training. Workers across Europe should have individual rights to training. We should have rights to be able to upskill and reskill. We should have rights which link to where the jobs are being created. So you can't just do this at company level. We have to think about regional just transition plans, because jobs will not necessarily be in the same places. We have to have individual pathways. The transition will happen on a mega level, but it will be experienced by individuals in their workplaces. So individual rights in a collective framework are extremely important. And at European level at the moment, it's all assumed that the goodwill of companies and the market will deliver this just transition. And if we know one thing at European level, it's actually that the market has largely failed. And the energy price crisis is a very good example of showing how markets are not delivering the transformation that we need, not delivering the investment that we need, not delivering the social justice that we need. So we need to have this comprehensive framework at European level. I'll finish on this last point. When the Green Deal was tabled by Frans Timmermans, he said it will be a Green Deal. It will only be a Green Deal if it's also a social deal. Well, now politicians at European level and at national level have to walk the talk, because the biggest danger is that people were promised just transition, were promised that no person, no region would be left behind, and that those promises don't materialize on the ground for workers right across Europe who are directly impacted by this transition. There we have a lot of ground with other organizations. We march with Fridays for the Future. We march with the environmental movement. There is a lot of common ground in this, but unless there's a strong social stamp on the policies going forward, I fear that we will see a big backlash, which would be very dangerous for this generation and will be catastrophic for future generations. Thank you.
Liebe Jude, vielen Dank dafür.
Thank you very much, Jude, for this. I remember that at the beginning of this parliament, there was a social summit in Gothenburg, and things were meant to be undertaken to improve the social pillar and to enlarge those entitlements. But let's move to Michael Bloss. He's a member of the European Parliament. He is the Speaker for Climate Policy. And if you want to know how the climate law functions, then you turn to him and ask him. So we look forward to what he has to tell us, how he thinks the way forward should look like, and what can actually be achieved in this European Parliament. Let's hear Michael.
Well, let's see if we'll ever manage that. And maybe it's not really necessary for the Greens to get the absolute majority. It's more important that everyone joins in order to prevent the climate catastrophe. But let me start by looking back at everything that happened and what we achieved. So 2019 is when we started with this climate election. And back then, we had a Commission President von der Leyen as a new Commission President, and nobody knew what to expect. And then she took this topic, climate protection, and said, this is my big topic. I'm going to make a Green Deal. And then we got a climate protection law in Europe that was negotiated for the very first time, and I was part of these negotiations. And then we stipulated that by 2050, Europe is supposed to be carbon neutral, and by 2030, we want to have lowered our CO2 emissions by at least 55%. And that's not bad. It's more ambitious than before. We got away from the 3-degree path to a 2-degree path, but it wasn't and isn't enough for 1.5 degrees. So a lot more needs to happen. But then after that, it wasn't enough to just have this title, Green Deal. It had to be implemented. So then we had many different sectors involved, not all of them, but many, for, rules for heating, energy, industry, buildings, So new legislative initiatives and proposals that we have negotiated over the past 4 years in order to get ahead. And I think that in some areas we have achieved something. So if you look at it, for instance, transport, at least now we put a stop to the combustion engine for 2035. It's not quite as ambitious as we wanted, but it's clear now that in this sector, there will be no more combustion engines with fossil fuels. It's the end of petrol. So, I mean, there was a lot of battles. There's now a large e-fuel lobby at the European level and a lot of fighting. And the German transport minister Wissing also did a lot of damage. But in the end, the law, the legislative act still stands, and 2035 will be the end point of the combustion engine. And then in this area, industry and energy, we strengthened emissions trading. So we gave it teeth, sorry. And it's the most important instrument for climate protection in Europe at the European level, putting a price to CO2. So CO2 certificates are being traded, and that leads to a certain price per certificate. And that has been strengthened. So by 2040, no further new certificates will be given out. So that means that there is a limit to the number of certificates. And so we had an increase of the price to about 90 euros. So with a high CO2 price, it's no longer economically profitable to use coal to produce electricity. So we said if we can expand it, renewable energies, then in 2030, coal, by 2030, coal would be phased out in Europe. I mean, that would be huge. I mean, not just for Germany, but for the whole of Europe. If we achieve that, then that would be great. And then for renewable energies, we've doubled our objectives. So also about 80% renewable energies for the electricity production. And we said by 2030, licenses for solar and wind facilities, the time to get your license should be shortened. It can't be take longer than 2 years, or in some cases even 1 year. But now things are starting to slow down. So we were supposed to adopt that renewable energies law, but France is blocking it because they want nuclear power to also be recognized as renewable energy, and so they're refusing to agree unless that's the case. And of course, the last important part is energy performance of buildings. So buildings, and at the German level and also on the European level, there are huge resistances to change. We have buildings that are not well insulated at all, and they should be renovated first. And of course, there should be cheaper prices and support for the inhabitants, but we're not really getting ahead there. And there was a broad political consensus in the beginning but at the moment, that's no longer the case. We had to fight against the CDU, the German conservatives, to put an end to the combustion engine. And we were also getting a lot of headwind for buildings now. So we had all these successes against fossil industries in transport, in energy, etc. So now the last strongholds that the fossil industry still has to sell their gas, that's buildings. So of course they're defending it with everything because they want to continue to sell gas this ways, and they're fighting with everything they have. And especially in Germany, that's very clear at the moment. So what has to happen now? What's next? So on the one hand, I think it's really important to make it very clear that there's a difference between a fossil interest and the interest to protect the climate. Protecting the climate is a public good. It's to the good for the benefit of everyone. And on the other hand, we have fossil industries, and they, of course, have their business case, and they don't want to give it up. And people are putting that on equal footing, but it isn't equally important. I think that's important to say and really to tell them you have to change. So these ideas we've heard earlier about that we can just continue to emit and then somehow compress that and then bury it, that's not going to work. And another point that Jude had, we need alliances now because things are becoming more difficult. And one important alliance is with the social partners, the trade unions, etc. So it's not just a deal about reducing CO2, but you really want to improve people's lives in a tangible way. And this social aspect that Jude said a lot of very useful things about, that is important. And I think we need something like climate support in Europe so that families can see, people can see that, yes, it's a type of redistribution measure and we actually benefit a bit from climate protection. And the other point is that the other industries, climate industries, where future jobs will be, so electrolyzers, heat pumps, solar facilities, wind power, etc. These are sectors that are going to grow, and then we'll have that kind of balance where at some point there will be a tipping point towards progress. And also, agriculture is missing from the Green Deal. It's an external dimension. This entire issue, are our trade agreements compatible with our climate goals, or are we actually undermining our climate goals with our trade agreements because we just don't produce CO2 here in Europe, but we're outsourcing it to third countries. So these are important topics, and the Greens in Europe have fought really hard, also together with some others. We've achieved some things, and at the moment we are noticing that the wind has turned. It's now headwind for us, and everything that would support climate protection is seen or spun as a burden for farmers, for socially weak, etc. Thank you, Michael. So you said that there's no longer that broad consensus to protect the climate, and I think that is a great bridge to Ricarda Lang, federal chair for the Green Party. She had a tough day. If you follow German politics, then of course you know what happened today. I think there's going to be lots of questions, and welcome. I'm happy to have you here after such a day, and I'm sure you can tell us about the consensus in Germany, but also in Europe, but the federal government isn't really behind it anymore.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm really very happy to be here finally after a very exhausting day. And I have to be honest, it was a rather frustrating day. We do have a situation where we have good news in technically speaking. 5,000 people went missing in Congo because of flooding, billions of damages in Italy because of waters rising, of flooding. We have situations in France and in Italy where we must concede that this is caused by the climate change. And we have a consensus on the climate protection that dates back a few years, but now it is being eaten away. Friedrich Merz says that we have time until 2035 so that it can be put off as if it could be put off. And now we need to find out how we got there and how we deal with this problem. I think we really have to become much more concrete. We should say that we need to really diminish the gas house emissions by so and so much until this and that a year. But now people realize that their private life will also be affected. If I quit nuclear power generation, for example, I talk about an industrial area and about a lot of jobs, but I don't consider for once what sort of heating system the people affected have installed in their private homes and what cars they drive. And I think we really need to reconsider. We need to promise security to the people. It is very clear that we cannot wait for the eternal future. This leads to much less security. And to then argue that we would move forward in a slower pace makes the living prospects of the people much more uncertain. Because the slower I go forward, the hotter my climate will become. And then another very central question is the social question. I think that we need to learn for ourselves. We need to be able to criticize ourselves for having overlooked it. It has to be a central question. It has to be the first question in actual fact, the social question. And it also means that we need to show the social consequences of the climate crisis. Let's not only talk about the collateral measures in order to dampen the social damages of the climate transition. We need to be able to identify the real social problems and need to be able to spell them out. And it would mean, for example, that if we went down the road that is being initiated now by the political parties in this parliament, then we would not go forward with the German law on building energy efficiency, for example. People will need to take investments. People have their private homes and they would be upset if they were asked to invest in it. They will probably opt for the cheaper investment, which would be a gas heating system. But then from 2027, the prices for oil and gas will jump up because the emission trading system will kick in and the times of cheap gas deliveries or supplies from Russia are over anyway. And those people would really be the victims of a wrongly perceived development. And I think we also need to consider the tenants. Tenants have no say whatsoever. They have no choice because rather short-sightedly, a proprietor can install a gas heating or even an oil heating perhaps, and then the tenant will have to pay much higher heating costs. And that is just very misleading and it creates much more friction socially. So the climate crisis in itself can actually aggravate a social disruption. And we have to admit this and have to look into the social dimension. So let's also look at the social consequences. Let's look at the support that can be offered in a socially adapted way to people having to invest into different heating options. We also need to move to the offensive because there's a dualism at play. We have a bit of a debate on the state versus the market. The state will only do whatever the market does not produce. Of course, we need the market. We also need to leverage the powers of the market. We have the European emissions trade system, and we'll also have it in the energy market. I hope that you will allow me to expand a little bit on this issue. Because if the prices will then increase all of a sudden in 2027, people will not be looking at the certificate trade now, but they will be overrun by this trade. And we need very clear regulation initiated by the government in order to move away from this dual approach. The price alone will not regulate the climate protection policy. We need new standards that need to be set by the state. Some may think that we are forever in the defensive, but I don't agree with that, because in the world we can see a huge development like the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, for example. Globally, we used to have a race to the bottom, and people went for those who had the lowest standards. But now we have an upward trend in standards because we want to promote all those who will create the new jobs in new, highly developed technological areas and industries. And climate protection is not one subject among so many others. It'll be the prerequisite for our social well-being and for our liberal democracies in a future, and I'm sure that we will need to take that approach. Unfortunately, I haven't heard all of you who spoke before me, but I think it is important to also look at the European replies, like, for example, Repower EU and the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's look at the differences. We normally work with regulations, but we don't offer investments because the European Union cannot by itself start investments. So if we take climate protection seriously in Europe, and if we want to promote social well-being with a better climate policy, then we need new fiscal rules. We need a strategic industry policy at the European level and go for the climate objectives. Excellent. Thank you very much, Luisa. I'll summarize in 3 sentences. Those who follow, who are from the European member states and don't know about the political situation and the topical debate in the parliament in Germany, let me tell you that a new an act is being debated or read in the German parliament on the energy efficiency of buildings. But the Liberal Party said that they had 100 questions about this new legislative initiative, but they didn't want to submit it to the parliament. And we have a problem with the Liberals also concerning the e-fuels, for example. They simply blocked progress and they even blocked the debate. I don't think that this is a purely German phenomenon, but I'd just like to give you that information by ways of explaining what the background to the disputes at the political scene are. I'll now be taking on the questions from our participants and put them to the panelists. And if someone amongst the panelists would also like to reply to a specific question, then you're most welcome to raise your hand, and we'll hope to take a maximum of questions.
Claudia Kemfert.
Okay, Claudia Kemfert, we had the discussion about heating, but also generally on climate protection and society's attitude. And the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, and I'm really quoting extremely roughly, I'm paraphrasing, we should just leave it as is, ban for specific types of heating or any sort of prescriptive rules for heating would be bad, just leave it to the market. There would be too much resistance, just let the price be the determinant factor. What do you think about this as an energy economist and a climate researcher? Is that economically the right path to just let the price fix it? I don't share Mr. Meyer-Edenhofer's point of view for two reasons. First, the price instrument isn't wrong to start with. I'm also an environmental economist, and I understand the approach. So from an economic point of view, external effects should be part of the price. And then you have CO2 pricing, and that will provide an efficient solution in economic terms. But if you want to be truthful, you should also add to that price elasticity for heating is low. So CO2 prices would have to be extremely high. And the study of the MCC shows that. In 2019, our institute has also calculated it just like the study. And so it would have to be like 400 euros per ton CO2. That would have to be the price in order to lead to reduced emissions in heating. And these CO2 prices would then make oil and gas very expensive and heating costs very high. And we've heard the speakers before made it clear that this is a social issue as well, and I agree with that. Poorer people will have a lot more trouble shouldering this compared to richer households. So CO2 pricing and using that will really be a bigger burden for poor households, as they would in a worse position to actually choose their own heating type of heating as well, depending on where they live, how they live. So, of course, there will be other measures to assuage this, but the social impact would be enormous. And I really think that this is not the way to go. It can be a flanking measure, the CO2 price. We have seen that in other studies, a certain level of CO2 price, yes, but it can only be a part of a broad range of measures. And especially for heating, you need different types of concepts, so support and clear signals, and bans at this point can be helpful too. That's my second point. Recently, we have published a study, the Expert Council for Environmental Questions, and the clear result was that price signals are very unpopular. And we know that certain political parties, as soon as prices increase, talk about energy price caps, and we've seen it also during the energy crisis. The first thing was petrol price support, etc., electricity price caps. But that is the opposite of what price signals are supposed to achieve. I am not a fan of electricity price breaks, etc., but that's a little bit of a different topic. But that is the background. If you're talking about CO2 prices, you always have to add the instruction leaflet with the side effects and risks high prices for gas and oil and petrol, and many studies show that oil and gas heaters would then just cost 20,000 euros more. And that's something the households would have to pay for. And we have also found that these price signals are very unpopular, politically unpopular. And that is why politicians react the way they do. And bans and prescriptions are often easier accepted. Maybe that's something that is hard to accept for some people. But people understand that. It's like a stop sign. It tells them to stop. You can't cross here without stopping. So if you explain yourself and explain that there are bridging periods, etc., then bans and prescriptions are often more popular. That's the result of several studies. So that would be my second response, that not everything can be dealt with the CO2 price. In order to defend Professor Meyer-Edenhofer, later in the interview, he did add that it had to be a mix. So just to add that. But yes, I think that is the consensus. Very few economists say that price could be the only tool. But that was the way you posed your questions, and that's why I reacted. And that's also what the media reported about what he said. I didn't read the interview, but he said that we have to start from scratch with the bill. We'd have to start over because we went in the wrong direction. And I don't think that's true. I think we should build on it and continue to work on this draft, because we are creating insecurity with companies, with the economy, and people, because and that's also making things more expensive. So I don't think that's the way either. I don't think we should start over and just bet on prices. And I've explained why. Ricarda, you're raising your hand, but I wanted to address you anyway. We heard Robert Habeck in one of our webinar, and he talked about German climate support, but the FDP would be the party in the Ministry of Finance, would be responsible to finding a way to distribute that climate support. And so let's talk about that. Yes, that's one thing I wanted to say. This entire debate about prices. Of course, there are many factual arguments, but also a lot of dishonesty. It's the same parties that are always saying that we should leave it to the market and prices, etc. And we've talked about this with the FDP, the liberals. They keep saying that. And then some of them say we should just say that we're starting with the European laws that will enter into force 2027 earlier in Germany. And okay, accompanied by climate support and social redistribution, it could work. But at the very moment when oil prices rose last year, they wanted the petrol discount. I mean, as soon as the prices then increase, they want to subsidize fossil solutions. So they're not honest about this. They're not serious. And Max, you already said it. The very fact that we still don't have a payment mechanism for the climate money that we have, the climate support, it just proves it. Because in the long term, CO2 prices can only be used if we have this climate support at on the same time. So it should be this for everyone. That's one proposal. Other people say that it should be staggered, so less money for wealthier households. But we will need some sort of climate support and some sort of distribution mechanism, and we will continue to exert pressure for this. Thank you. Luisa, we have gotten two questions on this. or on a similar question that you also mentioned positive narratives and good narratives. So climate support, I mean, we've seen it in Austria. It's working quite well there. It can lead to positive associations with climate protection, and you mentioned that. So I would like to add to that two questions from the audience. Heiner is asking, what are we doing against this communication strategy to be against everything that's green and this clash of cultures that isn't really helping climate protection at all. So that was one question. And then Bebel Winkler is asking, what can we do against such campaigns, against the like the one against the building energy draft, because these populist slogans not easy to get rid of once they're out there. So how can we also have positive slogans out there? Yes, I think all of these questions are very important, and many people at the moment have the impression that climate protection is a technocratically monstrous in its implementation, and that's the impression that people get. So people feel that yes, we should do something. It's important. It's time, but nobody really believes that it can be done in time, and people are losing faith in the government, in what's even possible. But yes, also especially in public administration, and that is quite shocking. So if that sort of standstill will continue, it's not going to help democracy. It will contribute to a sort of erosion of democracy because people will feel that when a crisis hits, we can't rely on our government to master it. And then you have a more individualism. People will not be ready to act. And so this is a very democratic issue to prove that democracies can grow with their challenges and that we're always better off if we are acting in solidarity and are there for each other, and if everybody contributes what they can shoulder. And at the moment, the implementing things is getting more and more technical. That is true. A million little things have to be gotten right. So that is just a fact, but that has to be flanked by positive narratives. Yes, 1.5 degrees, what does that mean? And it's what's behind that is something very emancipated. Children will be safe to breathe cleaner air. We know that the basis of our livelihoods will not be lost. Parents are not faced with that choice, that Jude mentioned. In the job market, it just means that nobody will have to work a job that will pay their rent, but towards the end of the decade, harm the planet. So if jobs are more sustainable, then of course you don't have to make that choice, and without leaving people behind. And we know that if we don't make an effort, lots of these new jobs will go to men, because engineering jobs, etc., women don't choose that profession. And so that is something that we have to work on as well. So it's important to look at what do 1.5 degrees mean? So that buildings are better insulated, that we don't have to pay as much for heating because you're not losing all the heat to the outside, and we will be safe long term if it costs something, if it costs us something in the short term. And as the climate movement, we somehow felt that we had to really yell and tell people and shout at them until they understand that there is a crisis. But we don't have to do that anymore because people are kind of tired of hearing about crises. And I think now we have to really create some enthusiasm for solutions that are there and have this positive narrative. So the last question was, what can we do against a populist, the heating hammers, populist myth like that? Ricarda said some things about this. And from the point of view of activism, I would say you can be very, very self-confident and really tell these populist voters powerful things and these positive narratives. So what it is all about. So that also means we're not negotiating about facts. There is a fossil backlash at the moment. We have to be louder and we have to make sure that people know this, and we have to also get back to our alliances. So we hear something about prices, and that could be the solution to everything. You have to work with associations against that and saying, well, we are the experts and we've analyzed this and it's not going to work. So you have to know who to talk to debunk these things. Thank you.
Thanks very
so
much.
Jude, over to you.
Punkte gesagt, gerade was Partizipation und Requalifizierung.
Jude, you should be coming in about qualifications and participation and social justice at the European level. And you are very European-minded. Do you think we can learn from each other in Europe? Can we learn from other countries? Perhaps you would have some examples to share with us where it works well. With social buffers, for example, and with creating the awareness that climate protection also needs to have a social dimension. Let's have a look.
Yeah, thanks very much. In fact, I just wanted to first respond to something that Luisa said, but it kind of ricochets off something that Ricarda said earlier about developments in the US and the Biden administration's climate policy and the Inflation Reduction Act, because I think if we're looking for how we build a narrative, how the narrative which has been built by the Biden administration is actually really interesting, because it's about good quality jobs in blue collar areas, about a future for the people who are at the actual and the proverbial coalface in this transition, and actually through the use of social conditionalities tied to the different subsidies which have been put on the table, whether it's the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, or whether it's through the CHIPS Act. There's some really imaginative social policy being developed in the US, and it seems very strange for us in Europe with our social market economy to say we should be inspired by the big dark neoliberals on the other side of the Atlantic, but actually there are some really exciting developments there. For example, in the Inflation Reduction Act, you can't access a subsidy for an electric vehicle if 15% of the work is not undertaken by accredited apprenticeships. What we have in Europe is a massive skill shortage. The demographic pyramids in our industries, these industries which are transforming, are terrible. We're an aging population, and when we can't attract young people into these sectors which are growing. One of the biggest obstacles for the renewables industry, for the solar industry, for the wind industry, is finding the people to work in the sector. We see more and more figures showing that companies can't complete their orders because they haven't got the workforce to deliver. So we need to have a real narrative about people working in industry is actually about addressing the climate, and that those are climate jobs, even if it's in a steel mill, a transformed steel mill, if it's in a PV, a photovoltaic plant, if it's in a plant building heat pumps or another one of the critical technologies that we need, batteries, the transformation of the automotive industry, and so on. So we need, what the Biden administration have done is to hardwire into the legislation an enormous investment in young people, bringing young people into those industrial value chains. That is proactive industrial strategy, and it's completely missing in Europe. The second part is something Luisa said about the gender dimension. Yes, if you look at the jobs which are going, if you look at the transformation underway, we're talking about a lot of male jobs, but actually we don't have enough men. I'm sorry, Max and Michael and all the participants, we don't have enough men in Europe to fill the job vacancies that we have today or in the future. So we need to be far more imaginative about how we bring women into these sectors. And if you look at the CHIPS Act in the US, the subsidy for the developing of the semiconductor industry is tightly tied to the provision of childcare, to family-friendly working patterns, to bringing in more women into the industry. We should be developing similar kinds of social conditionalities in Europe. It doesn't mean a straitjacket of the same thing in every member state, but what it does mean is that you would hardwire the social dimension into a European industrial strategy. And then maybe just to come to your question about what's happening elsewhere in Europe, we've done a lot of work in industrial Europe looking at just transition planning and activities in different companies. We have a lot of good practice examples. You can find them. I'm going to move in the right direction on, no. Well, I can't work out my finger. On our website, we have a Just Transition website, which has practical examples of how Just Transition is being negotiated by workers in companies at regional level, at sectoral level, at national level in different countries. And there are some really inspiring examples. But the key thing, which is essential for delivering a good transition, is strong and stable industrial relations. If you don't have a strong collective bargaining framework where there's trust between the social partners, it's nearly impossible to negotiate the level of transition that we're talking about in society. And that demands stronger worker participation. And it feels strange saying this in a more German context, because Mitbestimmung is such a central part of German economy, but actually Mitbestimmung is also on the decline in Germany. What we need is a reinforcement also at European level of worker participation, ensuring that we have not just democratic debate in civic democracy, but you can't have free democracies without strong industrial democracy. The two go hand in hand. So worker participation is absolutely vital if we want to ensure that this transformation is done in a socially fair way, where there are trade-offs. We know inside the trade union movement that we will have to give ground, that there will be trade-offs. But if there's nothing in return, if it's just a demand of more pressure on workers, intensification, more and more crappy jobs with bad working conditions, we're not creating the sustainable transformation that we really need in Europe. Thanks.
Ja, vielen Dank. Kann ich nur sagen, ich war.
Thanks very much. I went to a steel steelworks in Duisburg, and I saw how they tried to introduce green hydrogen in those steelworks. And I think it is so important and so fascinating to see how it can work when the awareness is there and the will is there, that the people become really proud of being part of the transitional process. And I think that is really important, because you can found alliances alliances on the basis of that. You just have to take people along on that journey. Luisa. Yes, I'd just like to add something else. I think it's a very important issue. You really need to recognize the negotiators, but very often we talk about emotions, we talk about the cultural background, we talk about power, and I think you are totally right. It is a wonderful reaction that if you say you feel hurt and you want to defend yourself, then all of a sudden you hear the strangest of stories just to buy more time and just to divert from the sheer necessity to move forward in the direction of climate protection. So we need to have this debate on arriving really quickly at a solution for the climate crisis. A lot of emotions come up, and we need to be very, very honest with ourselves, and perhaps we also need to negotiate about feelings and fears, and not only about scientific facts. Claudia. Absolutely. A lot has already been said, and I think it is very important what's just been said about the industrial jobs, because it is something that we've seen in our studies also. There's a huge readiness there to move along with the change and be part of the transition. It's not only the young workers who want a future in their industry, they want social justice, of course, in the future, and they also would like to be active in a job which makes them proud. And some of them feel neglected and don't want to accept that they will become obsolete in certain parts of industry, like in coal mining, for example. We'll also need some very classic and traditional art and trade, craftsmanship. It will still be needed in future. And I absolutely agree with Luisa that there's a lot of emotional debate going on, but the transformation needs to be socially acceptable and socially just. And there's another thing that I would like to remind you of. There is a backlash active right now. And it is very powerful, I'm afraid. I already have had the debate for 20 years, but I think that the dimension of the backlash is huge now. It's a fierce one at that. And I don't think that we feel it so much on the job or maybe in the streets or when we talk to one another, but we really notice that in the style of communication and in the campaigns that have started. Things that we used to know from the US only, where we used to have the skeptics and those who were absolutely defiant. But I think we now have to clearly name the elephant in the room and show that a very targeted attack is being waged against the press, about certain politicians, and against the democracy itself and our democratic values. And it's those people who want to deviate from promoting climate protection. They want to leave everything as is, as it was in the past, and return to business as usual. And I have to say the fiercefulness is really quite impressive. And I think we need to be aware of the fact that those socially weak in our society are perhaps the first victims of such campaigns, and people will probably believe such forceful campaigners of those quarters that simply claim that the policy for climate protection is completely ill-conceived, and we'll have to make sure that we secure our democratic values and that we avoid a dual society as in the US, where we have a split of 50 to 50% perhaps, and it's a debate that should really raise our consciousness and make us react. That exactly is the problem. You'd like to include everyone in this final round in the debate. Sorry for speaking so long. I think that all your contributions were really excellent, and I'm so happy to have this panel. And I think we see that from the reactions of the participants too. Ricarda, you'll get the question of Philipp Schmalgold, who asked, what happens if one of the coalition groups will turn against the decisions of the coalition, and in inverted commas he puts in brackets he puts FDP. What happens with all the other agreements of the coalition and all the other decisions that you jointly took? If the Liberal Party decided to simply take the break, then what do you do? Well, let me come back to the emotions in this debate that Luisa mentioned. There is one point which is really true. The irrational and the emotional needs to be taken into consideration, where people say, oh, but it won't work and I'm afraid of these changes, and will we really succeed? We'll have to allow for that. Although the science is on our side, and I think that is something that we should not lose sight of as politicians. We must take that into consideration, that people are afraid and that they are very emotional about these transitional processes. I'm normally very hesitant to speak about campaigns, which Claudia just mentioned, but we've had years and years where huge amounts of money were invested in fossil energy sources, and where the dependency on gas simply increased. And everybody knew all along that we needed to quit those fossil energy sources. So I think we do have a situation where we should normally have a huge opportunity right now to move in exactly the right direction for the future of our planet, because the fossil fuels will simply not be affordable any longer. And KKR, who's one of the biggest partners of Springer, and they also instigate these campaigns against climate protection. And the Conservative Party, the CDU, pretends being at the defense of the normal citizen. However, they clearly defend the interests of industry. We simply have another opportunity to defend our legislation on energy efficiency of buildings. It also is a question of the authority of the Chancellor. We will have to see whether we can trust the agreement of the coalition. And at the same time, we need to put the question, how are we going to support the socially weak in our society? We need to offer them clear choices and amounts, and a lot of things are unpleasant in this debate, but obviously we don't see any alternative to accelerating the implementation of this policy. Thanks, that was very clear. And now we will go on for another 5 minutes because we'll have to close this webinar in a structured way. Michael, I would like to put a question to you from Vero. It was written in English. The EPP blocks the nature law. What can we do as climate activists in order to save this piece of legislation, which is kind of neglected in the general public? I think we need to, first of all, take stock of the situation that the consensus is crumbling. And of course, we do have the Green Deal, but the Green Deal is not done yet. That was the title of the webinar. Is the Green Deal done? No, the Green Deal is on its way. It also has to do a lot with the conservation of nature, for example, zero pollution, no toxins released into the environment. There's a huge process that has been started, and perhaps we've accomplished about 10 to 15% of it. And for the moment, we are deviating from the normal direction. There's a lot going on that puts a lot of pressure on the farmers, and therefore we don't have a majority on certain measures. Today we talked in the committee about it, and with the majority of the Conservatives and the right-wing party, we were defeated in our endeavor to do more for the nature conservation. Ricarda mentioned the fact that perhaps we're not faced with a campaign, but at the same time, we need to say we have achieved something, we've done things that are highly toxic and dangerous for the way we lived and we organized ourselves and did business in the past. We demand very forcefully that everything changes and that we take out the fossil fuels. And I think people will not be welcoming such a profound change per se, or without trying to defend their status quo first. And that is why we will need to go on, and it'll be the job and the task of our political generation, I think, to keep going. And now we need to perhaps close the debate. I think everything was right that was being said here. Let me briefly try to summarize what we talked about, and let's please remember that we talk about human beings, and human beings have a head and a heart and a soul, and they may feel hurt. They may be fearful of what's coming their way. Let's not forget the society that we have to take along. We have to take them on board. Now, how can we take them on board? By seeking alliances, for example, new alliances with the social partners, with the trade unions, with a new industry, with a climate-friendly industry, for example, an industry that will not pollute the atmosphere, that will use energy coming from wind or from the sun. And I think we're all about improving the living conditions of the citizens at large. And it's something that will not only concern owners of houses, but also tenants, for example. And if you can see that your meter will come up with less consumption of energy, then that'll make everyone happy, of course. Let me also add something which may sound very abstract. We can only do this together in Europe. We talked about the United States. We can also talk about China in order to achieve the transition. And we must all be aware of the fact that Germany alone cannot achieve a climate transition, nor can Europe alone achieve the energy transition. We will have to make sure, first of all, that it all works in Italy, in Bulgaria, in Greece, and on Malta. And only then will we be able to practice and to safeguard the democratic rights in Europe. So we do need a Green Deal 2.0, certainly, but it is a task that will keep us going for a very, very long time. And I heard a lot of very positive and exciting stories today, and it gave me a lot of energy to carry on. And I hope that's also true for the participants of this webinar, and that we all carry on doing what we do. Thank you all for having participated. Thank you all. Thanks to all our speakers, to the panelists, and thank you also to the interpreters. Thank you to all those who put questions to us. I've put quite a few things up in the chat. You will find further reading there, for example, but let's carry on. Let's work for the climate transition. Have a nice evening and see you next time round. Thanks very much and goodbye.